My name is Lauren Whitaker, and I'm 31 years old. 5 years ago, on Christmas morning in my parents' living room in Orange County, California, my father handed my sister Brittany the keys to a brand new Tesla Model S worth $78,000 while the entire family applauded and took photos. Then my mother turned to me, smiled politely, and placed a small red envelope in my hand. Inside was a $10 Starbucks gift card. $10. That was the difference between how my parents value their two daughters. But what none of them knew that morning, what my father didn't know when he raised his champagne glass and toasted Brittany as the future of the Whitaker family, was that the money used to buy that Tesla didn't belong to them at all. It came from a trust fund legally set aside in my name. And 5 years later, I would walk into a California courtroom and prove it. The judge's ruling that afternoon forced my parents to repay hundreds of thousands of dollars, stripped my sister of the car she'd been bragging about for years, and exposed a family secret that had been quietly building since I was 12 years old. But before I tell you exactly how a $10 gift card turned into a lawsuit that changed everything, take a quick second to like this video if stories about standing up for yourself resonate with you, and consider subscribing to the channel because we share real stories about people who were underestimated and refused to stay small. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop your city and time in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let me take you back to the moment that started it all. Christmas morning, December 25th, 2017. My parents' house was exactly the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Large white colonial-style home, perfectly trimmed hedges, two luxury SUVs in the driveway, and a neighborhood where people casually discussed property values over brunch. Inside, the living room was glowing with Christmas lights and a 12-foot tree covered in gold ornaments my mother insisted were imported from Italy, even though I later found the same ones at a department store for $29 a box. My sister Brittany stood near the fireplace wearing a silk robe and holding her phone like she was already expecting something worth posting on Instagram. Brittany is 3 years older than me, confident, charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention. My parents loved that about her. My father, Daniel Whitaker, ran a regional construction company and believed success was measured by visible wins. Cars, houses, impressive job titles. Brittany matched that image perfectly. I never really did. I was quieter, more analytical, the kid who read contracts for fun in college and chose law school instead of business. My mother used to say Brittany had presence, while I had potential. At the time, I didn't realize potential was just a polite way of saying you hadn't proven yourself yet. That morning my father stood near the front door holding a small black key fob in his hand, smiling the way people do when they know they're about to make a dramatic announcement. "Brittany," he said, stepping aside and pointing toward the driveway, "you've worked hard this year, and we're proud of you. Why don't you see what Santa left outside?" Brittany laughed, already filming with her phone as she pushed the door open. The cold December air rushed in, and a second later, she screamed so loudly the neighbors probably heard it across the street. Parked in the driveway was a brand new Tesla Model S, pearl white, the kind of car that cost more than most people's yearly salary. My mother clasped her hands like she was watching a movie scene unfold exactly the way she'd imagined it. My father walked outside and draped his arm around Brittany's shoulders while she kept repeating, "Oh my God, this is insane." The cameras came out. Photos were taken. My father explained to anyone who would listen that Brittany deserved it because she had just started a marketing position at a prestigious firm in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, I stood just inside the doorway holding a mug of coffee, trying to look as excited as everyone else. After about 10 minutes of celebration, we all came back inside. Brittany was already texting friends and posting pictures online with captions like "Best Christmas Ever." My mother disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned holding a small envelope. "Lauren," she said gently, "we didn't forget about you." She handed it to me with the same smile someone might give a coworker during an office gift exchange. I opened it expecting maybe tickets to something, or at least a thoughtful card. Instead, inside was a $10 Starbucks gift card and a slip of paper that said Merry Christmas. I remember staring at it for a few seconds, waiting for someone to laugh like it was a joke. No one did. Brittany barely looked up from her phone. My father had already started explaining the Tesla's autopilot feature to my uncle. And in that moment I realized something that had actually been true for years. In my family story, Brittany was the investment. I was the afterthought. What I didn't realize yet, what none of them realized, was that the Tesla sitting in the driveway had been paid for with money that legally belonged to me. And discovering that truth would eventually lead me somewhere my parents never expected. Straight into a courtroom. I wish I could say that Christmas morning surprised me, but the truth is it did not. In my family, the imbalance had been building for years, quietly, steadily, like interest accumulating in an account no one talked about. Brittany was always the daughter my parents invested in. I was the one they expected to figure things out on my own. When Brittany turned 16, my father walked into the driveway one Saturday afternoon with a red ribbon tied across the hood of a brand new BMW 3 Series. I remember the exact number because my father loved talking about numbers when they made him look successful. $32,000, he said proudly, tapping the hood while Brittany hugged him, and my mother filmed the moment for social media. That same summer I turned 16 as well. My birthday gift was a city bus pass that cost $89 for the month. My mother handed it to me at the kitchen table and said it would help me become independent. When Brittany graduated high school, my parents hosted a celebration dinner at a private restaurant overlooking Newport Harbor. 50 guests attended. There was catered seafood, a custom cake that cost $600, and a speech from my father about how Brittany was destined for extraordinary things. 2 years later, when I graduated from the same high school with the highest academic honors in my class, we celebrated with takeout pizza at home because my parents said everyone was busy that week. Brittany attended the University of Southern California with full financial support from our parents. Tuition alone was $65,000 per year, not including the apartment my father leased for her near campus, which cost $2,400 a month. I remember the day my college acceptance letter arrived. I had been accepted to a public university in Northern California with a strong pre-law program. I sat at the kitchen table holding the envelope while my parents listened. My father nodded slowly and said that was impressive, but explained that they had already committed significant financial resources to Brittany's education and expected me to be more practical. Practical meant student loans, scholarships, and 2 part-time jobs during the school year. By the time I graduated college, I was working early mornings at a campus coffee shop, afternoons in the university library archives, and evenings tutoring first-year students in constitutional law. I slept about 5 hours a night and tracked every dollar I spent in a spreadsheet because I had to. Meanwhile, Brittany spent her summers traveling with friends, posting photos from Santorini, Barcelona, and Aspen. Whenever relatives asked my parents about their daughters, Brittany was the story they told. She had presence. She had ambition. She had a future people could see. I was the quieter footnote. The interesting thing about growing up that way is that eventually you stop asking for fairness. You adapt. I learned to rely on systems instead of expectations. While Brittany networked at marketing events in Los Angeles, I became fascinated with how financial structures actually worked. Trust accounts, inheritance law, consumer protection statutes, the quiet frameworks that determined who controlled money and why. By my 3rd year of law school, I could read a financial document the way an architect reads blueprints. I did not realize at the time that this skill would eventually dismantle the illusion my parents had been building for decades. There was only one person in my family who ever seemed to notice the imbalance without pretending it was normal. My grandfather, Arthur Whitaker. He was my father's father, a retired civil engineer who still lived in the modest two-bedroom house he had purchased in the 1970s for $85,000. Compared to the rest of the Whitaker family, he lived simply. He drove a 10-year-old sedan, drank black coffee every morning, and spent most afternoons reading historical biographies in the small study behind his living room. But he watched everything. One Sunday during my second year of law school, I visited him the way I often did when I needed a quiet place to think. He poured 2 cups of coffee and asked how classes were going. I told him about a course I was taking on financial trusts and estate law, explaining how legal structures could protect assets across generations. He listened carefully and nodded in a way that suggested he understood more than he was saying. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stayed with me for years. "Lauren, families have stories they tell the world, and then they have the truth underneath those stories. If you ever want to understand what is really happening, follow the documents." At the time I thought he was offering general life advice. I had no idea that sentence would eventually lead me to uncover something hidden in my family's finances that explained far more than favoritism. Because by the time that Christmas morning arrived in 2017, the difference between Brittany's world and mine had already been measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Tesla in the driveway was simply the moment when that difference finally became impossible to ignore. The weeks after that Christmas passed quietly on the surface, but something inside me had shifted in a way I could not ignore. I returned to my small apartment in Irvine, a studio that cost $1,200 a month and had just enough space for a desk, a bed, and the stacks of legal textbooks that seemed to multiply every semester. Brittany, meanwhile, was posting photos of her new car almost daily. The captions were always the same tone of celebration. First drive. Best surprise ever. Feeling grateful. I remember one post clearly because it included the exact model details. Tesla Model S, long-range battery, premium interior package. My father had mentioned the price during Christmas dinner as if he were announcing a company milestone. $78,000 before taxes. The number stayed in my mind not because I was jealous, but because numbers have always told stories if you look at them long enough. Around that time, my grandfather Arthur called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if I could stop by his house the following weekend. His voice carried the calm tone he always used, but there was a seriousness underneath it that made me curious. Saturday afternoon I drove to his place, the same modest house where the paint on the porch railings had begun to fade and the small lemon tree in the yard leaned slightly toward the sun. When I walked in, he was sitting at the dining table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. Next to his elbow was a thin folder made of brown paper, the kind accountants often use for financial records. He greeted me with the same quiet smile he always had and asked how work was going. At that point, I had just begun my first position as a junior associate at a consumer rights law firm in downtown Santa Ana. My job mostly involved reviewing contracts and assisting senior attorneys with documentation, but I loved the work because every file felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. After we spoke for a few minutes, he slid the brown folder across the table toward me. "Lauren," he said calmly, "I want you to take a look at something and tell me what you see." Inside the folder were several photocopied documents. Bank statements, trust account summaries, and something labeled Whitaker Family Educational Trust established in 1998. The moment I saw the words educational trust, my attention sharpened. Trust accounts were legal structures designed to protect funds for specific beneficiaries, often children. I scanned the first statement slowly, following the columns of numbers the way I had been trained to do in law school. The account balance listed on the earliest page was $400,000. Deposits had been made periodically over the years by my grandfather, intended to fund educational expenses for both of his grandchildren, Brittany and me. My grandfather watched silently while I read. Then I noticed the withdrawal column on a statement dated December 21st, 2017. The amount listed was $78,412. The transaction description was labeled Vehicle Purchase Transfer. My eyes moved to the account authorization line below it, and that was when the detail that changed everything appeared. Authorized by Daniel Whitaker, trustee. My father. For a moment, I simply stared at the number again, letting the realization settle into place piece by piece. The amount matched almost exactly what my father had bragged about paying for Brittany's car. I looked up at my grandfather slowly and asked the question that suddenly felt unavoidable. Was that money supposed to be used for both of us? He nodded once. It was set aside for education and life expenses equally. Half for Brittany, half for you. The room grew very quiet then, the kind of silence where you can hear the ticking of a wall clock across the house. I began turning through the pages again, this time more carefully. There were earlier withdrawals, too. Tuition payments made directly to Brittany's university. Apartment rent reimbursements. Travel expenses. Meanwhile, the column for distributions in my name remained almost empty except for a small scholarship reimbursement years earlier. The numbers told a story my family had never spoken out loud. Over time, the trust had been used primarily for Brittany while my portion remained mostly untouched. Until December 21st, 2017. The Tesla purchase had not come from my parents' personal accounts the way everyone believed. It had come directly from the trust fund that legally belonged to both of us. I closed the folder slowly and asked my grandfather why he was showing this to me now. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together in a way that suggested he had been thinking about this moment for a long time. Because sometimes people reveal who they truly are when they believe no one is paying attention, he said. And when that happens, the truth tends to leave a paper trail. I remember looking down at the documents again, the neat rows of numbers that suddenly felt less like financial data and more like evidence waiting to be understood. At that moment, I still did not know exactly what I was going to do with what I had discovered. But one thing had become clear. The story my parents had been telling for years about generosity and success was not supported by the documents sitting on that table. For the next few days, I carried copies of those documents in my briefcase, the way someone carries a secret they are not ready to share yet. Every morning I took the train into downtown Santa Ana and sat at my desk reviewing consumer fraud cases, but my mind kept returning to the same number printed on that statement, $78,412. The exact amount that had left the trust account just days before the car appeared in my parents' driveway. Numbers rarely lie. They simply wait for someone patient enough to read them correctly. One evening after work, I spread the photocopies across my kitchen table and began going through them line by line the way we had been trained to analyze financial records in law school. I wrote notes in the margins. I circled dates. I traced the flow of money from the trust into secondary accounts and eventually into the dealership payment confirmation. The pattern was simple and disturbingly clear. The account titled Whitaker Family Educational Trust had been established by my grandfather nearly 20 years earlier with the explicit purpose of supporting both of his grandchildren equally. Overtime deposits from his engineering pension and investment income had slowly grown the balance to more than $400,000. But beginning around the time Brittany started college, withdrawals increased dramatically. Tuition payments, housing reimbursements, travel allowances, each one authorized by the trustee listed on the account documents. My father, Daniel Whitaker. By the time Brittany finished university, the trust balance had been reduced by nearly half. And yet, I had never received any distribution that resembled the scale of support Brittany had been given. The final withdrawal before the statement I was holding was the one that paid for the Tesla. When I added everything together using a spreadsheet on my laptop, the difference between what Brittany had received and what remained allocated to me was well over $200,000. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment because understanding the numbers meant accepting something I had spent years trying to ignore. My parents had not simply favored one child emotionally. They had done it financially using money that was never fully theirs to control. The next Sunday, I visited my grandfather again and brought my notes with me. He listened quietly while I explained what I had found, occasionally nodding as if each detail confirmed what he had suspected all along. When I finished, he poured another cup of coffee and looked at me with the steady patience he had always shown throughout my life. What do you think happens when someone entrusted with managing money uses it in a way the documents do not allow? He asked. The question was not rhetorical. It was a test of whether I understood the law well enough to answer it honestly. I told him that in many cases it could be considered a breach of fiduciary duty. Trustees were legally obligated to manage trust assets in the best interest of all beneficiaries. Using those funds disproportionately or for unauthorized purchases could open the door to legal claims. My grandfather nodded again and said something that felt less like advice and more like permission. The law exists because fairness sometimes needs structure. Families are not immune to that. I asked him whether he had confronted my father about the withdrawals. He shook his head slowly. If I had raised the issue years ago, he would have explained it away. People are very good at justifying decisions when they believe no one is examining the details. But now you have the documents and the knowledge to understand them. What you choose to do with that is entirely yours. That night I drove home along the coastal highway with the windows down and the ocean air moving through the car, thinking about the difference between what had happened and what everyone believed had happened. My parents believed they had simply rewarded Brittany with an expensive gift because she was the successful daughter. Brittany believed she had earned the car because she represented the future of the family. But the documents suggested something far less comfortable. The purchase had been funded by money intended for both daughters, not just one. And legally, that distinction mattered more than any holiday celebration or social media post. Over the following weeks, I continued reviewing the records whenever I had time, building a clearer picture of how the trust had been used and what rights I might have as a beneficiary. I did not feel angry in the way people expect when they hear stories like this. What I felt instead was clarity. The kind that comes when the facts line up so precisely that ignoring them becomes impossible. At some point, every person has to decide whether silence is easier than truth. And as I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by statements, authorization forms, and handwritten notes, I began to realize that the quiet imbalance that had defined my family for years might eventually have to be addressed in a place where stories no longer mattered as much as evidence. I did not rush into any decisions after reviewing the documents. For nearly 2 months, I continued living exactly the way I always had, going to work each morning, reviewing case files, attending meetings with senior attorneys, and quietly returning home in the evening to the same small apartment where I had spent the past 3 years building my career. On the surface, nothing had changed, but internally I was processing the situation with the same methodical patience I used when analyzing a legal case. The facts mattered more than the emotions. One evening in late February, I decided to organize every document related to the trust account into a single timeline. I printed additional copies of the statements, spread them across my dining table, and began labeling each transaction by date and purpose. The earliest withdrawals from the trust corresponded with Brittany's college tuition payments beginning in 2012. Each semester, there was a transfer of approximately $32,000 sent directly to the university. Then there were apartment rental reimbursements averaging $2,400 per month. Several travel expenses appeared during summer months, some labeled educational conference reimbursement, even though Brittany's social media posts from those same dates showed beach resorts and ski trips. As the years progressed, the pattern continued. Brittany's expenses were regularly approved and processed through the trust, while the column representing my share remained almost untouched. The imbalance was not subtle. It was measurable. By the time Brittany graduated, more than $260,000 had been withdrawn on her behalf. My own distributions from the same trust totaled just over $12,000, most of which had been used for a single scholarship reimbursement during my second year of law school. I remember staring at that number for several minutes because it represented something deeper than financial inequality. It represented a pattern of decisions that had been quietly justified within my family for years. Brittany was considered the investment. I was expected to succeed without support. The final entry in the timeline was the withdrawal dated December 21, 2017, labeled Vehicle Purchase Transfer. $78,412. The exact amount that had funded the Tesla in my parents' driveway. When I finished assembling the timeline, I placed everything into a large binder with labeled tabs the way we organized evidence in the law firm. Seeing the information arranged chronologically made the story impossible to misinterpret. The trust had not simply supported one granddaughter more than the other. It had been used in a way that fundamentally ignored the equal distribution terms written in the original agreement. A few days later, I met my grandfather again for lunch at a small cafe near his house. I brought the binder with me and showed him the timeline I had assembled. He reviewed the pages slowly, occasionally adjusting his glasses to read the smaller print on the bank statements. When he finished, he closed the binder and rested his hands on top of it for a moment. I suspected the numbers were worse than even he had imagined. After a long pause, he looked up and asked a quiet question that forced me to confront the decision I had been avoiding. If a stranger had done this instead of your father, what would you do? I did not answer immediately because the truth felt heavier when spoken out loud. In any other situation involving misused trust funds, my firm would advise the beneficiary to pursue legal remedies. The law was clear about fiduciary responsibility. Trustees were required to manage assets in good faith and in accordance with the instructions written in the trust document. Using those funds for purposes outside that agreement could expose the trustee to financial liability. When I finally responded, I said the same thing I would say to any client who walked into our office with evidence like this. I would recommend reviewing the case with an attorney who specializes in fiduciary litigation. My grandfather nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer all along. Then he said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. Justice does not become less important just because the people involved share your last name. That sentence echoed in my mind during the drive home. For years, I had accepted the imbalance within my family because confronting it seemed unnecessary or even disloyal. But the documents sitting in that binder were not opinions. They were financial records. And financial records carry weight in places where family narratives do not. Over the next several days, I researched legal precedents involving trust mismanagement, studying case law from California courts that address similar disputes. The more I read, the clearer the situation became. Trustees had a legal obligation to treat beneficiaries fairly and to follow the explicit instructions written in the trust agreement. When those obligations were ignored, the courts could intervene. By the time March arrived, I had reached a point where ignoring the information no longer felt like the responsible choice. The imbalance that had defined my childhood had quietly evolved into something measurable and legally significant. And once evidence reaches that level of clarity, the next step is rarely emotional. It is procedural. 2 weeks after finishing the binder of financial records, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in fiduciary litigation. Even though I worked in a law firm, I understood that representing myself in a matter involving my own family would be a mistake. Objectivity matters in legal disputes, especially when the people involved share history and emotion. The attorney I contacted was Marcus Hale, a senior partner at a litigation firm in Irvine known for handling complex trust and estate conflicts. His office occupied the top floor of a modern glass building overlooking the city, the kind of place where every detail suggested professionalism and quiet authority. When I arrived for the meeting, I carried the binder containing every document I had assembled over the past 2 months. Marcus greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a conference room where sunlight filtered through tall windows across a polished oak table. He asked a simple question first. "What brings you here today?" I opened the binder and explained the situation step by step, starting with the original purpose of the Whitaker Family Educational Trust and ending with the withdrawal used to purchase the Tesla in December 2017. I showed him the bank statements, the trust agreement, and the timeline I had created. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished speaking, he spent several minutes reviewing the documents in silence. His expression remained calm, but I noticed a moment when he reached the statement showing the $78,000 transfer. He tapped the page once with his pen and looked up at me. "Do your parents know that you have seen these records?" I shook my head. "Not yet." He nodded slowly and leaned back in his chair, as if considering the legal landscape carefully. Then he began explaining the situation in the same clear language he likely used with many clients before me. "The trust document," he said, "established a fiduciary responsibility for the trustee to manage funds for the equal benefit of both beneficiaries. If the trustee used those funds disproportionately or for purposes that favored one beneficiary over the other without justification, it could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty under California law." He turned the binder toward me and pointed to the series of withdrawals that funded Brittany's tuition, housing, and travel. Individually, some of these payments might be explained as educational expenses. But when the pattern becomes this uneven, especially when combined with a large discretionary purchase like a luxury vehicle, the legal argument becomes much stronger. I asked him the question that had quietly been weighing on my mind since the day my grandfather handed me the folder. If this were pursued legally, what would happen? Marcus answered carefully, because experienced attorneys never promise outcomes they cannot guarantee. The process would begin with a formal review of the trust records and a demand for accounting from the trustee. If the trustee could not justify the distributions, the court could order restitution or other financial remedies to correct the imbalance. He paused briefly before adding something that carried more weight than the rest of the explanation. Cases like this are rarely about the car or the individual transactions. They are about whether the trustee respected the responsibilities assigned to them when they accepted control over the trust. I remember sitting there for a moment absorbing the reality of what pursuing the case would mean. Legally, the path forward seemed clear. Personally, it felt far more complicated. Filing a claim would mean confronting my father directly in a public legal setting. It would transform years of quiet family imbalance into a documented dispute examined by a judge. Marcus seemed to recognize the hesitation in my expression. "These situations are never easy," he said. "Many people discover financial irregularities within families and choose not to act because they want to preserve relationships. Others believe accountability is more important than silence. Neither choice is simple. The decision depends on what you believe fairness requires." I thanked him for the consultation and left the office with a copy of his preliminary notes along with a formal explanation of my legal options. The late afternoon sun reflected off the surrounding buildings as I walked back to my car. For several minutes, I simply sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, looking at the binder resting on the passenger seat beside me. For most of my life, I had accepted the idea that family dynamics were not meant to be questioned. Some people were favored. Others learned to adapt. But the documents in that binder suggested something more concrete than favoritism. They suggested a misuse of responsibility tied to money that had never belonged exclusively to one person. As I drove home along the familiar streets of Orange County that evening, I realized something that made the decision ahead feel less emotional and more practical. The trust had been created to protect fairness between two grandchildren. Ignoring the imbalance would mean allowing the very structure designed to ensure fairness to fail without challenge. And once a situation reaches that level of clarity, silence stops feeling like peace and starts looking like permission. For several days after meeting Marcus Hale, I did not make any immediate move. Instead, I carried the knowledge with me quietly, the way someone carries a heavy document inside a briefcase that no one else realizes exists. Every morning, I arrived at the office before 8 o'clock, poured a cup of coffee from the machine near the conference rooms, and began reviewing case files the same way I always had. But my attention kept drifting back to the question Marcus had asked me during our consultation. What does fairness require? That question lingered longer than any legal argument. One evening near the end of March, I drove to my grandfather Arthur's house again. The sun was setting over the neighborhood when I parked along the curb in front of his small two-bedroom home. The same lemon tree leaned toward the street, and the porch light had just begun to glow as the sky turned pale orange. Inside, the house smelled faintly of brewed coffee and old books, exactly the way it always had since I was a child. My grandfather was sitting in his usual chair in the living room reading a biography about early American engineers. When he saw me, he placed the book on the side table and smiled quietly. "You look like someone who has been thinking about something important," he said. I sat across from him and told him about my meeting with Marcus Hale. I explained what the attorney had said about fiduciary responsibility, about the possibility that the withdrawals from the trust could legally be challenged. My grandfather listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if each detail confirmed something he had already suspected. When I finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence in the room. Finally, he asked the question that I knew would eventually come. "Are you considering taking action?" I answered honestly, "I do not know yet." Because the truth was that the legal path forward felt straightforward compared to the emotional weight of what it would mean. Filing a claim would transform years of quiet family imbalance into a formal dispute examined by a court. It would mean challenging my father's decisions in a way that could not be ignored or explained away. My grandfather leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands the way he often did when he was about to share something important. "Lauren," he said, "fairness is not the same as revenge. Sometimes people confuse the two. Wanting accountability is not the same thing as wanting to hurt someone. The difference lies in your intention." His words settled into the room slowly, and I realized that was exactly the line I had been trying to understand for weeks. I was not angry in the dramatic way people imagine when they hear about family disputes involving money. I was simply aware that a system designed to treat two people equally had been used in a way that did not match its purpose. The next weekend, my parents invited the family to dinner at their house. It was one of those gatherings that looked perfectly normal from the outside. The dining table was set with polished silverware. My mother had prepared roasted chicken and vegetables, and Brittany arrived last, driving the same white Tesla that had appeared on Christmas morning more than 2 years earlier. She parked it in the driveway the way someone parks a trophy. Throughout dinner, my father talked about his latest construction contracts, while Brittany described a marketing campaign she was managing at work. I listened quietly, occasionally answering questions about my law firm when they asked. At one point, my mother mentioned how proud they were that Brittany had recently paid off part of her student loans. That statement caught my attention because according to the trust records I had studied, Brittany's tuition had largely been covered by withdrawals from the trust. I realized in that moment how completely the family narrative had replaced the documented reality. Everyone at that table believed the story that had been repeated for years. Brittany had succeeded through talent and support. I had succeeded through independence. The number sitting in the binder on my desk told a different story entirely. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back patio while the others continued talking inside. The evening air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic from the main road. From where I stood, I could see the Tesla parked near the curb, its polished surface reflecting the porch lights. For a moment, I considered what it would mean to simply walk away from the entire situation. I could ignore the documents, continue building my career, and let the imbalance remain part of the past. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence would not erase the facts. It would simply allow them to remain unresolved. The trust had been created with a specific purpose, and the evidence suggested that purpose had been compromised. As I stood there looking at the quiet street, I understood something that had been forming in my mind since the day my grandfather handed me the folder. The decision ahead was not really about family conflict. It was about whether the principles written into those documents still meant anything at all. I returned home that night with a clarity that felt different from anger or resentment. It was the kind of clarity that comes when a long pattern finally reveals itself in a way that cannot be ignored. The following Monday morning, I arrived at my office earlier than usual, placed the binder containing the trust documents on my desk, and spent nearly an hour reviewing the timeline again from beginning to end. Each entry confirmed the same conclusion. The withdrawals had not been balanced between the two beneficiaries, and the purchase of the Tesla had been authorized using funds that legally belonged to both Brittany and me. Once I reached the final page, I closed the binder and realized the question was no longer whether the facts were clear. The question was whether I was willing to act on them. That afternoon, I called Marcus Hale and scheduled a second meeting. When I arrived at his office 2 days later, he already had a legal notepad on the conference table and a copy of the trust agreement open beside it. He greeted me with a nod that suggested he understood why I had returned. "Have you made a decision?" he asked. I told him I had spent several weeks thinking about the situation and reviewing the records again and again. The imbalance was not a misunderstanding or a small accounting error. It was a consistent pattern that had gradually shifted a significant portion of the trust toward one beneficiary while leaving the other almost untouched. Marcus listened carefully while I spoke. When I finished, he asked one final question that sounded simple but carried a great deal of weight. "Are you prepared for the possibility that pursuing this could permanently change your relationship with your family?" I answered honestly. I believe the relationship already changed the moment those funds were used in a way that ignored the trust agreement. Marcus nodded slowly, as if that response confirmed what he needed to know. He then began outlining the next steps in a calm procedural tone. The first stage would involve sending a formal request for accounting to the trustee, which in this case was my father. The request would require him to provide a detailed explanation of how the trust funds had been distributed and whether those distributions complied with the legal obligations defined in the trust document. If the accounting revealed irregularities or could not justify the withdrawals, the next step would be filing a civil claim in California court alleging breach of fiduciary duty. The goal would not be punishment but restitution. In other words, restoring the financial balance the trust was originally designed to maintain. I listened carefully as Marcus described the process. Each step sounded less dramatic than people imagine when they hear about lawsuits. It was structured, documented, and deliberate. Legal disputes rarely begin with arguments. They begin with paperwork. After the meeting, I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the formal request Marcus prepared. The document summarized the trust terms, listed the withdrawals in question, and requested a complete accounting of all distributions made by the trustee over the previous decade. Seeing the information written in precise legal language made the situation feel both more serious and more real. When Marcus finished reviewing the final draft, he slid the document across the table toward me. "Once this is delivered, the situation moves from private concern to formal inquiry," he said. I signed the authorization allowing his firm to proceed and left the office with a strange mixture of calm and uncertainty. The following week, the request for accounting was delivered to my father's office by certified mail. For several days, there was no response. Life continued in its usual rhythm. I went to work each morning, reviewed case files, attended meetings, and occasionally thought about the envelope that had arrived at my father's construction company headquarters with the law firm letterhead on it. Then on Friday afternoon, my phone rang while I was sitting at my desk reviewing a consumer contract dispute. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I answered the call knowing exactly why he was calling. His voice was not angry at first. It sounded more confused than anything else. "Lauren," he said, "I received a letter from an attorney asking about the trust account." I kept my tone steady and explained that I had recently reviewed the trust records and noticed several withdrawals that required clarification under the terms of the agreement. There was a long pause on the line before he spoke again. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "The funds were used for family expenses." I responded carefully because the facts mattered more than emotion. The trust document specifies that distributions must benefit both beneficiaries equally unless there is documented justification otherwise. That was the moment when the tone of the conversation shifted. My father's voice hardened slightly as he asked why I had involved an attorney instead of speaking to him directly. I explained that the documents represented a decade of financial decisions, and the appropriate place to review them was through formal accounting rather than memory. The call ended shortly after that without resolution. When I placed the phone back on my desk, I understood something important about the path I had chosen. Once a legal inquiry begins, it does not move backward easily. It moves forward step by step, guided by evidence rather than family narratives. And somewhere in Orange County, my father was now reading the same financial records I had studied for months, realizing that the quiet imbalance hidden inside those numbers had finally been brought into the open. The weekend after my father received the accounting request felt unusually quiet. No one from my family contacted me again during those first few days, which told me something important about how seriously the letter had been taken. Legal documents have a way of changing the atmosphere of a situation even before anything officially happens. They shift conversations from assumptions to evidence. The following Wednesday afternoon, Marcus Hale called me while I was finishing a review of a consumer protection case at the office. His tone was calm but purposeful. "Your father's attorney responded to the request this morning," he said. That sentence alone confirmed what I had expected. My father had not tried to address the issue privately. Instead, he had hired legal representation. Marcus explained that the response included a partial accounting of the trust distributions along with a letter arguing that the trustee had broad discretion in determining how funds were used for the benefit of family members. I asked him what that meant in practical terms. Marcus summarized the letter in plain language. "Essentially, your father's attorney is suggesting that the withdrawals were reasonable family support decisions rather than unequal distributions." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the notes I had made months earlier when I first built the timeline of transactions. The numbers did not resemble broad discretion. They resembled a consistent pattern of financial preference. Marcus continued speaking. "The letter does not fully explain the vehicle purchase withdrawal or the difference in distributions between the two beneficiaries. Because of that, the next step is straightforward. We prepare a formal complaint and file it with the court requesting judicial review of the trustee's actions." Hearing those words felt strangely calm rather than dramatic. I had spent months examining the documents and considering every possibility. The legal path forward no longer felt like a sudden decision. It felt like the next logical step in a process that had begun the moment I opened the first bank statement. That evening after work, I drove to my apartment and placed the binder back on my kitchen table, opening it once again to the page that recorded the $78,000 withdrawal. It still looked exactly the same as it had the first day I saw it. Numbers printed neatly in a column. A transaction description. A signature authorizing the transfer. Evidence rarely changes once it exists. The following week, Marcus's firm filed the complaint in Orange County Superior Court alleging breach of fiduciary duty and requesting restitution for the unequal distributions made from the trust. The document was more than 20 pages long and described the trust history in precise chronological detail. Each withdrawal was listed. Each discrepancy was documented. The final section asked the court to determine whether the trustee had violated the legal obligations associated with managing the trust assets. When the filing became official, my father contacted me again. This time the call came late in the evening while I was reviewing notes for another case. His voice sounded controlled but noticeably sharper than before. "Lauren," he said, "I received the court documents today." I answered calmly because there was nothing emotional left to explain. The situation had moved beyond private discussion. I told him that the complaint simply asked the court to review the financial records and determine whether the trust had been managed according to its terms. He responded by insisting that everything he had done was intended to support the family. I did not argue with that statement because intentions are difficult to measure in legal disputes. Documents are not. I explained that the trust agreement defined how the funds were supposed to be used and that the accounting would allow a judge to examine the distributions objectively. There was a long silence on the phone after that explanation. Eventually, he said something that revealed how differently we viewed the situation. "You are turning this into a legal fight when it should have stayed inside the family." I replied quietly that the trust itself had been created specifically to ensure fairness between two grandchildren. Reviewing whether that fairness had been preserved was not an attack on the family. It was a question about whether the structure my grandfather built had been respected. The call ended without either of us raising our voices. When I set the phone down, I realized something that had become clearer with each passing week. For years, my family had treated financial decisions as private matters that could be justified through conversation or explanation. But once those decisions intersect with legal obligations, the conversation changes. The focus shifts from personal intention to documented responsibility. Several months later, the court scheduled the first hearing to review the accounting dispute. By then, the binder that once sat quietly on my kitchen table had been copied, organized, and submitted as evidence in a formal legal proceeding. The imbalance that had once been hidden inside bank statements was now part of a public record examined by attorneys, court clerks, and eventually a judge. And somewhere in Orange County, my father and Brittany were beginning to understand that the quiet pattern of financial favoritism that once felt invisible had now become something far more difficult to dismiss. The first hearing was scheduled for early September in the Orange County Superior Court building in Santa Ana. I arrived that morning about 30 minutes before the session began, walking through the glass doors into a lobby filled with the quiet hum of people waiting for their own cases to be called. Courtrooms rarely look dramatic the way they do in television shows. Most of the time, they are simply orderly rooms with wooden benches, folders stacked neatly on tables, and attorneys quietly reviewing notes while clients sit beside them trying to understand what will happen next. Marcus Hale was already there when I arrived, seated at a long table with several files open in front of him. He greeted me calmly and reviewed the agenda for the morning. The hearing would focus on the accounting records from the trust and whether the distributions complied with the terms established when the trust was created. It was not a trial yet. It was the beginning of the court examining the financial evidence. A few minutes later, my father entered the courtroom with his attorney. Brittany followed behind them, dressed professionally, but with an expression that revealed how uncomfortable the situation had become. Seeing them there felt unusual, but not emotional in the way I might have imagined months earlier. By that point, the case had become less about personal conflict and more about documentation. Everyone involved understood that the discussion would revolve around numbers, records, and legal responsibilities rather than family opinions. When the judge entered the courtroom, the room became completely silent. The clerk called the case, and both legal teams approached the front tables. Marcus began by summarizing the purpose of the trust and presenting the timeline of withdrawals that had been assembled from the bank statements. Each document was introduced methodically. The trust agreement showing the equal beneficiary structure. The statements documenting tuition payments for Brittany's university expenses. The housing reimbursements. The travel withdrawals. Finally, the transfer that funded the Tesla purchase in December 2017. The judge examined the records carefully, while Marcus explained how the pattern of distributions created a measurable imbalance between the two beneficiaries. My father's attorney then responded by arguing that trustees often exercise discretion when supporting family members, and that the withdrawals had been made in good faith for educational and family-related purposes. The discussion moved back and forth for nearly an hour as the judge asked questions about specific transactions. At one point, the judge focused directly on the vehicle purchase entry. He asked my father's attorney to explain how a luxury car purchase aligned with the trust's educational purpose and whether any equivalent distribution had been made to the second beneficiary. There was a pause in the courtroom as the attorney reviewed his notes before answering that the purchase had been viewed as general family support rather than a strictly educational expense. The judge nodded but made a notation on the file before continuing to review the financial summaries. What stood out most during the hearing was how different the situation sounded once the story was translated into numbers instead of family explanations. At the dining table, the Tesla had been described as a reward for Brittany's success. In the courtroom, it appeared as a $78,000 withdrawal from a trust designed to benefit two people equally. The difference between those two interpretations was the entire reason the case existed. After the attorneys finished presenting their arguments, the judge explained that the court would require a complete forensic accounting of the trust distributions over the previous decade. An independent financial expert would review the records and provide a detailed report analyzing whether the trustees' decisions aligned with the trust's legal obligations. The judge scheduled a follow-up hearing several months later to review the findings. When the session ended, everyone slowly gathered their files and left the courtroom. Marcus and I walked down the hallway together toward the building exit. He explained that the forensic review would provide a comprehensive breakdown of the transactions, something that could clarify exactly how the funds had been distributed, and whether the imbalance violated fiduciary standards. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflected off the surrounding buildings while people moved quietly through the plaza. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the fact that a situation which had once existed only in family conversations had now become a formal legal record examined by the court. For years, the story had been simple. Brittany was the successful daughter. I was the independent one who managed on my own. But inside that courtroom, the narrative had shifted from assumptions to accounting. The trust had been created with written rules, and the judge had made it clear that those rules would be examined carefully before any conclusions were reached. As Marcus and I walked toward the parking structure, he said something that captured the entire situation perfectly. When financial records enter a courtroom, they tell their own story. And once that story begins to unfold, it becomes very difficult for anyone to rewrite it. The forensic accounting report arrived 3 months later in a thick document that Marcus placed carefully on the conference table in his office. I remember the weight of it when he slid the file toward me, because it represented something far more important than a stack of printed pages. It represented an independent examination of every financial decision made within the trust for more than 10 years. The accountant appointed by the court had reviewed bank statements, transfer authorizations, tuition invoices, housing reimbursements, and the purchase documentation connected to Brittany's car. Every transaction had been traced and categorized with a level of detail that left very little room for interpretation. Marcus opened the report to the summary section and pointed to the final calculations prepared by the forensic analyst. The total distributions made on behalf of Brittany over the previous decade exceeded $284,000. My distributions from the same trust totaled just over $21,000. The difference between those two figures was not explained by any language in the trust agreement that allowed unequal allocation of funds. In fact, the report stated very clearly that the trust document described both beneficiaries as equal recipients of the trust assets unless specific circumstances justified an exception. The report concluded that the majority of withdrawals had benefited only one beneficiary and that the purchase of the Tesla represented a non-educational expenditure drawn from funds intended for both parties. I sat quietly for several minutes reading the summary again while Marcus explained how the findings would influence the next hearing. Courts often rely heavily on forensic accounting in disputes involving fiduciary responsibility because financial evidence tends to remove ambiguity. When a trustee is obligated to manage funds fairly, the numbers themselves reveal whether that obligation has been respected. The next hearing was scheduled for early January. When that morning arrived, the courtroom felt more focused than the first session months earlier. The judge already had a copy of the forensic report on the bench and began by summarizing the accountant's findings. Hearing the numbers spoken aloud in a courtroom created a different kind of clarity than reading them on paper. $284,000 allocated to one beneficiary, $21,000 to the other. A luxury vehicle purchase funded directly from the trust account. The judge then asked both attorneys to present their interpretations of the report. Marcus explained that the trust agreement required balanced consideration for both beneficiaries and that the financial history demonstrated a sustained pattern of unequal distributions that could not be justified under the document's language. My father's attorney argued again that trustees often exercise discretion in supporting family members and that the decisions had been made with good intentions. The judge listened carefully before asking a question that seemed to narrow the entire discussion to its essential point. Where in the trust agreement does it authorize using shared trust assets to purchase a $78,000 vehicle for one beneficiary without any equivalent benefit provided to the other? The courtroom was completely silent while the attorney reviewed the document again. After several moments, he acknowledged that the agreement did not specifically authorize such a purchase. The judge made another notation on the report and continued examining the financial summaries prepared by the accountant. After nearly an hour of discussion, the judge announced that the court would issue a ruling after reviewing the full accounting report and the trust document in greater detail. The hearing ended quietly, but the tone in the courtroom suggested that the evidence had shifted the conversation in a significant way. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and I walked slowly toward the parking structure while discussing the hearing. He explained that judges often take time after reviewing forensic reports because the findings carry serious implications for trustees who fail to follow fiduciary obligations. Legal responsibility in trust management is not based on intention alone. It is measured by whether the trustee's decisions align with the instructions written into the trust itself. Several weeks later, the official ruling was issued. The court concluded that the trust had not been administered in accordance with the equal benefit requirement stated in the agreement. The judge ordered restitution to restore the financial balance between the beneficiaries and required that the trustee reimburse the trust for the vehicle purchase along with additional distributions that had disproportionately benefited one party. When Marcus called to inform me that the decision had been finalized, I sat quietly at my kitchen table looking at the binder that had once contained the first copies of those bank statements. The entire process had taken more than a year from the day my grandfather handed me that original folder. During that time, the situation had moved step by step from a quiet family imbalance to a documented legal case examined by financial experts and a court of law. What began as a single transaction on a bank statement had eventually revealed a decade of financial decisions that did not match the structure my grandfather created when he established the trust. The ruling did not feel like a victory in the way people often imagine legal outcomes. It felt more like the completion of a process where evidence had finally been examined in the open rather than explained away in private conversations. The months after the court ruling felt quieter than I expected. Legal disputes often end with a dramatic moment in movies or television, but in reality most of them conclude with paperwork, bank transfers, and the slow adjustment that follows when a long-standing narrative finally changes. The court's decision required that the financial imbalance within the trust be corrected. My father was ordered to reimburse the trust for the vehicle purchase along with additional distributions that had favored Brittany disproportionately. The funds were restored gradually over the following months through structured payments arranged by the attorneys and the court-appointed financial administrator. From a legal perspective, the process was precise and uneventful. The numbers were recalculated, the accounts were adjusted, and the trust balance was restored to reflect the equal structure my grandfather originally intended when he created it. What changed more noticeably was the atmosphere within the family itself. For several weeks after the ruling, there was very little communication between us. Conversations that once revolved around holidays and casual dinners were replaced by a quiet distance that neither side seemed ready to bridge immediately. I understood why. When financial decisions that have existed quietly for years are examined in public, it forces everyone involved to confront realities that had previously been explained away through assumptions. My grandfather Arthur called me one afternoon, not long after the ruling was finalized. His voice sounded calm, but I could hear a certain relief beneath it. He said he had read the court summary carefully and believed the outcome reflected exactly what he had hoped the trust would guarantee when he created it decades earlier. Fairness, he said, is not about making everyone identical. It is about honoring the rules that protect people when power is uneven. Hearing him say that reminded me of the day he first placed the folder of documents on the table in his living room. At the time, I had not realized how significant that moment would become. The documents had simply been numbers printed on paper. Over time, they revealed something much larger about how decisions were made within our family. Brittany and I eventually spoke again several months later. The conversation was not dramatic or emotional. It was cautious, the way conversations often are when people are adjusting to a new understanding of the past. She admitted that she had never looked closely at how the trust funds were distributed because she assumed our parents were handling everything appropriately. I believed her when she said that because the entire system had been built on assumptions rather than transparency. The Tesla was eventually sold as part of the restitution process, and the proceeds were returned to the trust account along with the additional reimbursements ordered by the court. From the outside, it probably looked like a simple financial correction. But to me, the more important change was the clarity that followed. The trust no longer existed as a quiet background account controlled entirely by one person. It now operated under court-monitored guidelines that required transparent accounting for both beneficiaries. In the years that followed, I continued working at the law firm where I had started as a junior associate, eventually focusing more of my practice on cases involving consumer rights and fiduciary responsibility. Situations like the one involving my family appear more often than people realize. Many financial structures are created with good intentions, but without transparency, they can slowly drift away from their original purpose. Whenever clients ask me why accountability matters even within families, I remember the months spent reviewing those trust documents and the courtroom where the numbers were finally examined openly. The answer is always the same. Structures designed to protect fairness only work when someone is willing to ensure they are respected. One evening, nearly 2 years after the court ruling, I visited my grandfather again. We sat at the same dining table where he had first shown me the bank statements. The lemon tree outside the window had grown taller, and the late afternoon sunlight filled the room in a way that felt peaceful rather than tense. He poured 2 cups of coffee and asked whether I regretted pursuing the case. I thought about the question carefully before answering, because it deserved honesty. I told him that the process had been difficult in ways I had not fully anticipated, but I did not regret it. Ignoring the imbalance would not have preserved the family. It would only have preserved a misunderstanding about how fairness was supposed to work. He nodded quietly and smiled in the thoughtful way he always had when something important was finally settled. Sometimes the most valuable outcome is not the money being returned, he said. It is the truth becoming visible. Sitting there at that table, I realized that the entire situation had never really been about a car, a bank statement, or even a lawsuit. It had been about whether the principles written into a simple legal document still meant something when tested by real-life decisions. And in the end, the numbers answered that question more clearly than any family story ever could.